It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Deistler. He's a PhD student at the University of Tübingen, supervised by Edinburgh. He builds mechanistic machine learning tools for neuroscience as well as for other real-world problems. His interests include Bayesian inference, neural density estimation, uncertainty quantification, and computational neuroscience. And we also like to add that back in 2018, Michael did the research internship here at the University of Edinburgh, supervised by Matthias. And today he's going to talk about Bayesian inference for mechanistic models of neural dynamics.
Thanks, Carolina, and thanks a lot, Argentina, for organizing this and giving me the chance to speak here. It's a pleasure to be back, and I'm very happy to be here. Can you all hear me? Does the microphone work? Great. Okay, so I'll be talking about Bayesian inference for mechanistic models of neurodynamics, and specifically I'll be talking about how we can make sense of experimental data with the help of mechanistic models, and how we can use these models to understand the mechanisms that underlie the data that we can report. Okay, so over the past years, experimental techniques have become better and better, and we now have the opportunities to measure cellular processes in vivo, to measure thousands or 10,000s of neurons at the same time, or to measure behavior while simultaneously recording the activity of neurons. Now, these data in and by themselves are super interesting, but they don't really allow us to understand what's going on in the neural system, such that we stay favored. So the key tool in some of like the toolbox of computational neuroscientists is to build computational models in order to reproduce and understand how this data comes out. So think, for example, of the Hodgkin-Huxley model of neurodynamics, or think of models of leaky integrated fire neurons that interact together such that population activity can emerge, or think of normative theories of behavior. Now, when computational neuroscientists build these models, they usually want two things, or at least two things. First of all, they want to include mechanisms of what they believe is going on in the system and incorporate this into the model. For as example, right, like think about Hodgkin-Huxley, who wanted to include the mechanisms of ion channels in their model such that an action potential can come about. And the second thing that computational neuroscientists often want is that the model can reproduce the experimental data, so that there is a quantitative, maybe not just a qualitative, but a quantitative fit between the model and the experimental data that they've been recording. Now, unfortunately, achieving both of these things, the mechanistic properties of the model and the fit with experimental data, is often very hard to achieve. And in these models in neuroscience or in computational neuroscience can roughly be categorized into two groups. Now, obviously that's very rough, and we've already had a couple of models that are probably somewhere in between these two categories. But I'm just going to draw this like this, and we're going to have mechanistic models and statistical or machine learning models. When I talk about mechanistic models, I mean models that are very strong in this first category of including mechanistic insight in how they work. For example, Hodgkin-Huxley models or leaky integrated fire neurons that really care about the mechanisms that are going on. And on the other side, and on the other side, there are statistical or machine learning models like GLMs, RNNs, deep neural networks, which are often built rather with statistical convenience in mind, and which don't allow mapping the processes that go on in neurons, or in the real neurons, exactly to what's going on in the model. Now, while statistical models are built with statistical convenience in mind and therefore don't allow to map this, they're of course very easy to be fit to data, right? That's what they were built for. You can just create a descent and obtain a good fit with the data. On the other side, the mechanistic models are often hard to fit to data, and people just like tune the parameters such that they somehow match, or they use genetic algorithms, and so on and so forth. Now, the goal of my research is to combine the strength of these two approaches. We're trying to build algorithms that allow fitting mechanistic models to data, and thereby to allow computational neuroscientists to work with the model they really want to use, such that it includes the mechanisms, but at the same time still allows being fit to experimental data. So the key question we're trying to answer, or we're trying to address, is how we can fit mechanistic models to experimental data. So let me guide you through this in an example of a Hodgkin-Huxley model, but I want to emphasize that this approach that I'm presenting here is very general, and principally could be applied to any mechanistic model, for example, also a population of deeply integrated fire neurons that model population dynamics. So, given this model, and for example, a step input current, we can define parameters that are of interest. And now note that these parameters are really interpretable. Right? Like these are, for example, the sodium conductance and the potassium conductance, and not just some weight in a neural network, in a deep neural network, which we can really interpret. Now, given a particular parameter set, we can run this model and produce a spike train. But now what we're trying to do is to go the other way around. So we're trying to perform inference, meaning that given a particular spike train, or for example, a particular number of spikes, we're trying to infer the parameters that might have produced such an activity. And now importantly, in a lot of models in neuroscience, you're going to see what's called degeneracy or sloppiness, meaning that there's not just a single best-fitting parameter that can explain the data, but there's an entire distribution which all produce very similar results, and therefore might all be explaining the data. And in order to make robust or statistically robust hypotheses about what's going on in the neural system, we want to include all these parameter sets. And our idea, or our approach to identifying this whole distribution of parameters, is to phrase this as a Bayesian inference problem. So really what we're after here is after identifying the posterior distribution over these interpretable parameters given an experimental recording. Is that clear to everyone? Great. Yeah.
Where do you get noise in your QX activity?
What's
the nature of that?
Yeah, that depends. That can either be, for example, noise in the channels, or it can be noise in the input current, or in the easiest sense would be observation noise. But that really depends on what the modeler believes to be the sources of noise underlying the variability.
Okay, so that's supposed to fetch the slack between whatever the data is and what the model is, so the interrupt data distribution.
Yes, there's one way to go about this, but another way to go about this would be to just say that neural systems are inherently a bit noisy, right? Like if you have the same neural system and you stimulate it with the same step current, it's not usually going to produce the exact same answer, even if you had like perfect measurements. And if you have some idea about where this noise is coming from, you can just incorporate it in your model, for example, as noise in channels, or yeah.
So then it would be actually considering the distributional sense.
Yes, exactly, for example. But really, it's super flexible there. You can put noise into your system at any part and however you want. Yeah.
I was just basically my question got answered, but I guess just another way of putting it is that if you have a deterministic model, then you want to choose an additional noise model on top of that in order to then fit it within a probabilistic paradigm. But if you stuck with a purely deterministic model, as a function of the parameters, you might have problems.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So if you have a purely deterministic model, then essentially P of X given beta becomes a Dirac, right? The likelihood is a Dirac, and therefore if the model is identifiable, the posterior will also be a Dirac, and things are not so easily explained anymore. But I would say that in most cases, you either have some experimental or some observation noise in the measurement, or you have some intrinsic noise in the model. Yeah. Yeah.
Here you always need data, right? So you always need data to compare it.
Yes. Exactly. Like that's the goal, right? Like somebody gives you data and asks you, okay, can you please give me a model that explains this data? Okay. So let's look a little bit closer into the spatial inference problem that we're facing here. The posterior is proportional to likelihood times prior, And as all of you probably know, it is, well, if you want to Bayesian inference, that's kind of hard, right? You always need MCMC or something because you don't know the partition function. But in models in neuroscience, there's really another problem to performing Bayesian inference. And that's not just this computation of the posterior, but that has to do with the likelihood. And I want to go a little bit into detail about what I mean by this problem. So, if we have a model in neuroscience, for example, a network of leaky integrated high neurons, then if we want to evaluate the likelihood, that means we have to run this model, we have to simulate. And if you have a huge model now, then such a simulation can take like a couple of seconds or sometimes even a couple of minutes. So if you have an MCMC sampler around all of this, you're going to have to, at every step of the MCMC sampler, you're going to need to run your model, which can quickly take hours or days or way longer, and you won't be able to perform Bayesian inference anymore. Secondly, a lot of models in neuroscience are differentiable. That might be because they're not continuous, or it might just be because your model is implemented in Fortran or in Neuron, and you just don't have automatic differentiation yet. So, if the model is not differentiable, you can't use, for example, variation inference, or you can't use Hamiltonian Monte Carlo. And finally, in some cases in which there is intrinsic noise in the model, for example, channel noise, we can't even evaluate the likelihood at all, and we're just lost, we can't perform traditional Bayesian inference anymore. So given these constraints, I'm now going to write down like a wish list of properties that an ideal algorithm would have such that we can still perform Bayesian inference. First of all, we would like this algorithm to be very simulation efficient. We would like to run the simulator as few times as possible because you know it's expensive. Secondly, we would like to be able to parallelize simulations such that we can just like throw 100 different parameter sets on a supercomputer and run them at the same time. Thirdly, we don't want to use gradients because they might not be available. And lastly, we only want to require simulations and not likelihood evaluations. And in order to achieve this wish list, the key idea that we're pursuing here is to train neural networks to perform Bayesian inference for us. This is an idea that was first brought up in 2010 by Blum and François, and that was later on really brought to life, so to say, in this exact building by George Makarios and Ian Murray. So, how does this work? How do we train neural networks to perform Bayesian inference and apply Deistler? Again, I'm going to talk about the Hodgkin Huxley model as an example, but we can use any simulator for which we can run simulations. Starting off with the parameters, we define a prior over them. So for example, we just say, oh, we know that the sodium conductance is always between 50 milliseconds and 120. So we define a uniform prior over these ranges. Then we sample from this distribution, and we run the simulator in order to generate a simulated choice. And we don't do this just once, but we do it multiple times and generate multiple simulated choices. And here you can already see that this is parallelizable, right? Like, you can take these 100 parameter sets, throw them onto a cluster, and simulate them at the same time. Now, given these traces, we extract whatever features of the data we really care about. For example, if the experimentalists really want a model that reproduces a particular number of spikes, we would just extract the number of spikes from the simulated traces. So, we now have a database of parameter sets corresponding to a particular number of spikes. And what we now do is we train a deep neural network that takes as input the summary statistics, or the statistics of the data, and tries to predict the parameter sets that produce this. So this neural network essentially learns to invert the simulation. And this is a particular kind of neural network called a deep neural density estimator that doesn't just output a single best guess, but it outputs an entire distribution of all the parameter sets that might have reproduced the data. Now, once this is trained, we simply feed in the experimental data into the neural network, and the output of the neural network can be proven that if we train with a particular loss to be the posterior distribution. That's the main idea. This is what's called neural posterior estimation. We train a network on simulated data, and afterwards we just evaluate the experimental data and it returns an approximation to the posterior distribution. Now what you're probably already thinking is, well, what if the experimental data doesn't match the simulated data so well, so it's very difficult to achieve this. So maybe this posterior distribution is not perfect yet, and we'd like to refine it.
Sorry, can you say what you exactly mean by estimates the posterior distribution of parameters? So it parameterizes some distribution form that you have at the output, or
so it estimates a posterior distribution over these interpretable parameters.
right, but how specifically? I mean, is this you have some distribution form by Gaussian models and it's parameterized by the neural network, or
Exactly. That's exactly what's going on. In the simplest case, this neural network would just return a mean and a variance, which are then a Gaussian. You could then go on and say, oh yeah, now we have a mixture of Gaussians, but basically what we've converged on, because it works best, is we use a normalizing flow here. So normalizing flow is very flexible and can essentially capture almost any distribution. Yeah.
What if the relationship between the parameters and the statistics is non-continuous, maybe a chance?
Yes. If the simulator is highly nonlinear, in general it will be much more difficult for the method to figure out what's going on. I will have results later on though that show that it still can do it, but obviously it's going to be a more difficult problem and you're going to need more simulations.
But you don't need to assume continuous.
I mean, the neural network always only provides you with a continuous approximation, so I guess it's not going to be exactly the posterior if it's not continuous, but I would have to think about this a little more. Yeah.
Related question. So how to deal with the degeneracy in these parameters? For example, parameter C, because of the scale with all the equation C made, as if you scale to all the other equations on the right side. So posterior will be degenerate in some way.
Exactly. So essentially, say the posterior would be like a perfect line between these two parameters, right? Then the output of the neural network will be a distribution that's exactly on this line. And you could do this, for example, if you had multiple Gaussians, which you place one next to another, right, such that they form this line, or if you use a normalizing flow, then you can also do this.
yeah, but one other question about it. Maybe I'll come to the details later, but your input is a time series, right? Of like the spike parameter or the memory voltage or time. That's input to your neural network, right?
The input can be anything you care about. You can either directly feed in the time series and, for example, have a recurrent neural network to process this, but you can also really, by hand, select some features like number of spikes and just put those into the neural network.
Okay.
Whatever you want.
Okay. No, it just confused me because you have ground neural network as a default network. So.
Yeah, it can be anything. Any more questions? Okay. I was just saying, we have a way that this neural network now approximates the posterior distribution, but maybe this approximation is not perfect yet. So what we do then is we'd like to generate more simulations to refine the neural network. And we would like to pick parameter sets that are particularly important, such that we can learn this posterior better. So what we often do is we take the approximate posterior that we have, we generate samples from this posterior, and re-simulate and retrain the neural network. So this can be done in a round plan, like always, starting with some parameters, simulating, training the neural network, getting an approximate posterior. Sampling this, simulating, training, and this is what's called sequential neural posterior estimation, or SNPE, or we often call it SNAPE. And this idea was, as I said before, first proposed by Geoff McCarthy and Ian Murray, and was later on refined by many people. A lot of the methods come from our group. Okay, so this really summarizes what's going on. Given a model and a prior distribution of parameters, we're trying to make the model reproduce experimental data. So we generate simulated data and train this density estimator to invert the relationship between parameters and simulated results. And we then evaluate this network at experimental data to obtain a posterior distribution. This distribution can be sampled like any other distribution, and it can also be evaluated. So if we ask this posterior, well, how likely is this parameter set, or how well does it match the experimental data, it's either going to tell us, oh yeah, this matches very well, or it doesn't match at all. And samples from the posterior distribution are likely to match the data, so there are consistent samples that match the data, and the ones that are unlikely are going to produce activity that looks somewhat different. Yes?
Question. I'm confused about the presence of data on this plot. So the real data doesn't play a role in the training of the recognition model. You're just using that for the evaluation after you're done training your neural networks.
That's exactly right.
Okay. So I heard this.
Yeah. So, coming back to this wish list, I would like to discuss these things with you, right? So I already said that we can parallelize simulations here, because at every round we just have to run a bunch of simulations to generate the training data for the neural network. So that's fulfilled. Secondly, all that this neural network is trained on is on inputs to this mechanistic model and on outputs. So we don't care if the mechanistic model we're using is differentiable or if we know anything about what's going on in between. We only need a data set or a database consisting of inputs and outputs. Thirdly, we don't need likelihood evaluations. Again, we only need simulations. And finally, we can be very simulation efficient by closing this loop and iteratively selecting new parameters that are very important for our service. So, that's the method that we're suggesting, and I'm now going on to the second part of this presentation, namely demonstrating how well all of this is working on real neuroscience problems. And I'm going to be presenting 3 problems here. The first one is one that Pedro Gonzalez, a postdoc in the lab, has been working on, and then I will discuss 2 models that I've been dealing with in my PhD. Okay, so as a first example, to show you that all of this is really working, we're applying this to a Hodgkin-Huxley model, single compartment, 8 parameters, and we're trying to make this model reproduce as a first case simulated data. So we're trying to make it reproduce the number of spikes, the resting membrane potential, and moments of the spike training. And then we apply these tools, we get a posterior distribution over these parameters. So let me guide you through what you see here, because these are the sort of results you're going to see throughout this entire talk now. So the mechanistic model we had here had 8 parameters, which are, for example, solid conductance, passive conductance, and so on and so forth. And on the diagonal here, you see the one-dimensional marginals of the posterior distribution. So for example, you can see that the last parameter, which is the reversal potential of the lead conductance, has to be very narrowly tuned, whereas other parameters can range across wide, or can have quite wide ranges. And then on the upper diagonal, we're showing the pairwise marginals. So from this you can read off, for example, correlations that these parameters must have. So, because I told you this was simulated data, we also know what parameter actually generated this data, and this is what's shown in green, and you can see that this lies in regions of high posterior probability, which is a good test that things are working well. If we then go to the posterior, and we find the mode of the posterior, and simulate, we see that this matches the data well, whereas the parameter set that lies in regions of low posterior probability, so look, for example, over here, it's in a region that's quite outside of the posterior, and this will in general produce a simulation result that doesn't match the data. Finally, Paper also applied this to experimental data from the LNZ database, and you can see the results here. What you can see is that the experimental data at the top quite closely matches the maximum a posteriori estimate returned by our. So this seems to work well, but all of this was just a very small model for now, right? Just a partially massive neuron, like 10 ODEs or so. And now you probably think, well, can we scale this up? Can we scale this up to huge models with like 10,000s of equations or so, or like 10,000s of coupled ODEs? So to test this, we've been working on scaling this model to bigger systems. For example, the multi-compartment model. Yes, Becca.
Great, thanks. I'm just wondering, you're using parametric distribution for the posterior?
Yes.
There, is it a Gaussian distribution?
It's a normalizing flow.
Normalizing flow?
Yes.
I'm very well.
Yeah, I'm happy to chat about this offline. Unfortunately, I didn't include any slides about that.
Yeah.
Okay. So these models, or these cells, consist of thousands and thousands of compartments, each of which are governed by Hodge-Huxley equations. So the whole thing consists of 10,000s of equations. And what we're trying to do is, we're trying to infer the posterior distribution over the 3 parameters, which in this case are 20 parameters, which are maximal conductances and time constants. And we're trying to make the model reproduce data that looks like this. So for example, step 1 means that there's a step current injected to the soma, and the model responds with that many spikes. Whereas if you put a stronger step current in the soma, that would be step 3, there should be more spikes. And secondly, in the bottom row, what you see is that if you stimulate the soma, the activity can propagate through the dendritic tubes. Okay, so the really big challenge in fitting these sort of models with thousands of equations is that many samples from the prior don't do anything useful. So at the top row here, you can see the data we're trying to generate, and in the 10 rows below, you see what happens if we just randomly pick the parameters from the prior. And clearly there's nothing really helpful going on, or there's nothing even coming close. So when we just like simulated 30,000 times, trained the neural network, we achieved results that look kind of like this, which is a little bit better than the prior, right? You see sometimes spikes through, or there are some spikes in first, but overall it's not great. So in this case, we really needed the sequential scheme, where we now took this approximate posterior, again, sampled the parameters, resimulated, and retrained. And we did this across, in total, 6 rounds, at which point samples from the posterior distribution generated data that look like this. And now all of these samples are within experimentally measured variability of the observations, so we're relatively confident that all of these parameter sets might indeed underlie the data and might or mesh data relatively well. Yeah?
Is that procedure you just described related to expectation maximization?
What do you mean by this procedure? You mean the procedure of like closing this loop?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of sounds like it sounds like you're generating approximate. Maybe we can talk about this later. It can be a yes or no question. There's no obvious connection. Definitely.
I'm not aware of obvious connections. Okay. So we can again inspect the posterior distribution, and we again see that some parameters really have to be narrowly tuned, whereas others are quite wide. So overall, these results show that even if you have a model with like 10,000s of equations, these methods can work. It just takes a bit more time, and it takes a few more simulations, and it's a bit harder in order to get there. But it is possible to scale these methods to even very large systems. Yes?
How do the posteriors look like? Is it convex or you have multiple
So the results I just showed are like very, very recent. I really haven't gotten much into inspecting what the posterior looks like, but in the third application I'm going to do this in detail. So if you can wait for that, then I'm going to talk about it there. For this model, you're going to have to wait maybe another half year for that next session.
So, sorry, just to be sure, so the complexity of the model has increased, and the number of parameters of the model is 20, right? Which is, I mean, more than what you had in the previous example, but still not incredibly high. I mean, it's not like...
No, yes, absolutely. You're absolutely right. Like, the number of parameters is sort of probably the limiting factor to these methods. I'm not aware of any successful approaches of going to more than 100 parameters. Yeah.
So is there a relationship between the dimensionality of your problem, so how many parameters you're trying to do posterior over, and the number of iterations of retraining that you need to do? Like, maybe not in this context, but more generally in the SP literature.
In the what? SMP literature.
Yeah, I'm not doing that.
Okay. So, yeah, I'm being asked this question a lot of times, to be honest, and I never have a really good answer, because it really depends also, for example, on the data, right? Like if your simulator is linear, then you can technically solve like a 1,000 parameter posterior with just a few simulations. Whereas if it's super non-linear, it's going to be much more difficult. So it really depends, it depends on the exact model that you have. And yeah, exactly, it depends on the model that you have. But I would say that the method of doing this sequentially, like over many rounds, is usually more efficient than just doing it once.
And is that not biased? So like if the true prior distribution is not normal, and you start with something uninormal, and your posterior still stays in that model, is it possible to get weird results? By sort of like you're kind of treating your one iteration of fit as a prior for the next iteration. So you're kind of persevering in your beliefs, whatever those are.
That's exactly true. If basically it's like the first round got you into a completely wrong regime, then you're sort of lost. That's true. Luckily, the loss that's being minimized by the neural network is mode covering, meaning that the resulting posterior distribution will usually be broader than the true posterior. So that's kind of like a good sign, and to be honest, I've rarely witnessed cases where it really like converged into a wrong region, but in principle that's possible and it might happen.
Okay, and you're better off to start with really uninformed priors from the beginning?
To be on the safe side, yes, but obviously if you have better priors, it's going to be easier for them. So, overall, I've shown you that this works well in the complex models, but I haven't really talked about why you want to have the posterior distribution over these parameters. Like, maybe some of you have used, for example, genetic algorithms to produce these fits, or you've just like hand-tuned some of the parameters until you found the best parameter, and you've been happy, and that was the result. So, I want to address this in this third example, where we really tried to get into the posterior, analyze it, and see what sort of insights we can gain into a neural system that wouldn't have been possible if we just had a single best-fitting parameters. We did this in a model of the pyloric network, which is a small neural network in the lobster, and it produces these sort of data at the bottom right. It's known as the triphasic rhythm, where first the PD neuron starts, triggering a burst in the LP neurons and the PY neurons, and this whole thing repeats on like the order of a second, and the sole function of the circuit is to control the tooth in the lobster to crush the food in like a 1 second rhythm going on 20%. Now, previous research has established a model for this, consisting of 3 neurons interconnected by 7 synapses. And there are a couple of parameters, namely the maximum memory conductances and the synaptic strengths, that can easily be measured and that have to be inferred from data. So our goal is to identify the posterior distribution over these vertical parameters given the experimental data. Now, one reason why this model is so particularly interesting to us is a prior observation that showed that we can get almost the same activity from very different parameters. So what I'm showing here are two traces, left and right, that look remarkably similar. Right? Like, for example, the cycle durations or the burst durations are very, very similar. But these two traces were actually generated from completely different parameter sets, which are the bar heights here. This is an observation that was made by Prinzmann and Bucher in 2004, and it's triggered a lot of research into how precise the parameters have to be. So why is this interesting for us? Well, if we wanted to obtain a posterior distribution, given such a trace, we would expect it to have high probability for both of these parameters. So we would expect the posterior to have high probability in very extended regions of the parameter space. Now, we inspected whether this is true by taking the experimental data, choosing some summary statistics that are physiologically relevant for the system, and obtaining the posterior distribution over the 31 parameters, but I'm just going to show you a subset of them because it's easier to visualize. And indeed what we find is that the marginal distributions of the parameters are very wide, showing that indeed the data can be reproduced by very disparate parameter sets. And if we can validate this by sampling from the posterior, taking this parameter set, and simulating it, and indeed it matches the statistics of the experimental data relatively well. Okay, now, we then set out to analyze the posterior, and in particular we wanted to know of these two parameter sets that we have here. Are they somehow connected in parameter space, or do they lie in separate islands? So, if you think about robustness, then a neural system that would design its parameters like this would be very fragile if a perturbation comes in. Right? If one of the parameters gets perturbed, we would need some mechanism to drag us exactly back to where we were, otherwise the activity would break down. Or another scenario would be that the parameters for the posterior lies on some manifold in parameter space for which all parameters can reproduce the experimental data. So we checked which of these two hypotheses is true by identifying a path between these two disparate parameter sets. And this path is maximized or is optimized such that it lies in regions of high posterior probability. Now, once we have this, we can essentially run along this path, and we can check what happens along this path. So the green dot is where we currently are now. On the top right, you see the current activity, and what you're going to see is that as we run along the path, the activity stays very similar. Right? So we can essentially have large perturbations in the system, but nonetheless the activity remains very similar. This shows us that there are some perturbations to which neural systems can be very, very robust. I'm a bit tight on time, to be honest, but yeah.
But this was specifically about the picture. So I'm confused how you can get to points where one that has really low probability, one that has really high probability, and then the posterior that are equally good at extracting the data.
They both have high probability. I mean, okay.
Yeah,
maybe
these plots are confusing then.
So exactly, it might look as if this point had low probability under the posterior, but that's not true. The reason is that this is a marginal, right? So it's just a projection into two-dimensional space, and if we actually evaluate it for both of these parameter points, how likely they are under the posterior probability would be high for both of them. But yeah, this is a bit confusing.
So it's just that the alignment along the marginal trajectories are not very clear.
Exactly, the margins look a bit weird here, but they actually both have high posterior probability. I have not put that in mathematics.
Okay.
Okay. And so, yeah.
Sorry, just to add on. But is it the case that, I mean, is this a larger area, high posterior probability, or is it really narrow ridge or something? Because then you still have lack of robustness, basically, because, is it only along certain directions, or?
Perfect question, because this is going to be the next slide. So we're now looking at exactly this. We're looking at whether this is an extended space or whether there are some directions along those directions, everything just very quickly breaks down. So we identified another path, which is this small edge out here now, which as quickly as possible minimizes the posterior probability. So as quickly as possible runs into parameter regions which don't match the data. And so if we run along this path, after just a few steps, the activity is completely different, but the parameters have barely changed at all. So the parameters are over here, and you see that we only changed one of the synapses by a little bit, and still things break down. So there are indeed perturbations which are very harmful to neural systems, and for which there should be compensation mechanisms in order to really avoid these perturbations. Does that answer the question? Okay. There are a couple of more insights that we have. I'm going to go over those now, and going to come to my takeaway messages. So first of all, I've shown you a method that can do Bayesian inference in mechanistic models without relying on gradients, likelihood evaluations, and it's relatively efficient in the number of simulations that we can have. This approach is very general. All the models that I've been working on are models of small neural circuits or Hodgkin-Huxley models. But really, these methods can be applied to any simulator. And in the spirit of this workshop, I would encourage all of you to think about mechanistic models of large neural populations, for example, with weakly integrated neurons or whatever you want, and try out our tools in order to fit these models to data. And we have a toolbox that allows applying these tools, and if you have any problems with that, feel free to create issues. And then I've shown you that these methods scale to complex and nonlinear models, and that we can investigate, for example, correlations or insights into the mechanistic models. I'd like to thank all the PhD students and postdocs that work in Jakob's group for being fantastic colleagues and always up for discussions. I'd especially like to thank Jan Markus Löckmann and Jan Wiltz, who have been working on these things together with me. And I'd like to thank Jakob Hanke and Pedro Gonzalez, who are fantastic supervisors and great people, and I'm very lucky to be able to work with them. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you again. We probably have time for like 1 or 2 questions, and then we can discuss over lunch. So I think who was first? Okay.
Is there a way to easily estimate like the number of directions which are somewhat sloppy in your posterior, so the number of directions which you can go without losing much probability, losing much of the, like producing the result that you want to have?
I mean, eventually this sort of boils down to, or yeah, I haven't exactly looked at this, but eventually you basically want to do a dimensionality reduction there, right?
Yes.
You want to identify the dimensionality of your posterior,
yeah. And
you can just like generate, like say, 10,000 samples from the posterior and run any method you want on this and try to figure out the dimensionality.
makes sense. Thanks.
But it's very, I mean, the whole thing about perturbation at the end kind of reminds me that, like back then, you had this, fantastic idea about robustness to, that story better than me, I guess. And so I was wondering, so basically, if I look at your result, does that mean that I could do at least a Gedanken experiment where I would just go somewhat, record these models, these 3 models, and possibly find the parameters of your model. Let's say I can do that online because there is part of you can pull in that. And then possibly try to perturb this network, and there would be some specific direction where it would break down.
Yes, I would say so.
And so then then there are two possibilities here. Then the first one is that if model is kind of wrong in that sense, that somewhat, there are some variability in the parameters you don't want to see in the data. Like there are some fine-tuning. And there's a certain fine-tuning which you didn't see so far, but there is some fine-tuning. Or there's something missing in your model.
Both is absolutely possible. Yes, you're totally right. I mean, but I don't think that there's enough experimental evidence to say which of these two things it is, right?
I don't think you that. Yeah, no, I think that would need to be actually tested.
Yeah.
But it's a hard experiment to do.
Exactly. I mean, there are some experiments that demonstrate exactly this robustness, right? Like where they, for example, knocked out the potassium channel and saw that another channel basically compensated for that.
Yes.
So I'm not aware of any results.
But actually, at least for the experiment they tried, could you predict what they saw or not?
Yes. I mean, assuming that the model is a good model, then yes. And that's kind of the elegant thing about having this mechanistic model, right? Like, you can make predictions, and as long as this mechanistic model is a good model, its predictions are going to be good.
Yeah, no, I think the Malware case is perfect. It's kind of generating real experimental evidence that I think should be pursued. So that's good.
I think we ran out of time, but I see there's too many questions, so we can now think and end the session over lunch.